Yeah, so um, one thing Mohammed did arrange with the ONC is that we were able to apply our operational budget to all of our services that are out there, so they'll be available in the cloud. And then the repos are public, so we could continue to grow, these capabilities over time, even if it's if we gift those efforts to this purpose. So I think we're in a good place. I think we did a lot of good work the last 2 years. And I'd like to see it move forward. I don't know, Mohammed can maybe comment to this, but I'd like to see it more of a, we had a limited suite of use cases that we could address as part of the project. But there's a lot more work that we could be doing in the social determinants of health area and whatnot. And I think that's where there's a lot of interest as well. Any comments?
Right. And so the expanding use cases and application areas is one thing. We're also interested in actually getting this to a pilot, like a limited pilot somewhere in some application. And then there's also just technical expansion of the current core. Personally, like I'm very interested in being able to having an integration with OAuth and UMA server so that we can get a consent decision in the form of an OAuth token incorporated in the rest of the authorization ecosystem and things like that. Like we're working on a document. I'll put it out in the project documentation as a blog post. I think ONC has also asked me to submit some kind of like a future work and next steps document. So yeah, and then we're also open to discussing that if there is something that interests you that we haven't covered.
And Dwayne, going back, this is Ezekiel, going back to my previous question in the previous session that I had to jump to another session, but going back, and I'm new to consent and I understand the concept, right? And I'm trying to see how we can apply it in our organization. It seems to me like this repository that you mentioned, repository of items that we are going to give access to, or the patient, right, is going to give access to some actors to be able to see those. It seems it's something dynamic that we will have to keep updating over time, right? So as any organization collects information regarding a patient, those items to which the patient will give access to actors will probably have to be updated, right?
So when access is given in FHIR consent, there's a period, there's a start and end time that's defined within that. So you're absolutely correct. If a patient chooses to grant access to a given actor, physician, whatever, and they choose to only grant that access for 24 hours or a year or whatever, when it reaches that end date that within the period, then the consent decision service will no longer consider that as a viable consent, and you're either going to get a deny or no consent found for that type of exchange, right? So in the consent management UI or those services, there's a hook into the audit event, and the patient is able to see if somebody's asking for information, their clinical information. The CDS actually logs that event via FHIR audit event resource, and they can see that somebody's trying to get access. It identifies who the actor was. and at what date and what time, and they could act on it accordingly. So you're absolutely correct that these are living documents.
Now, let's say, for example, this organization, right? This organization is only, I don't know, an organization with access to prescriptions, for example, right? And this organization will implement a consent management tool,
Okay.
right? At that moment, the scope of information that organization has, it's only related to prescriptions. So that repository, it's only prescriptions, and prescriptions probably of this kind of medication. So when the patient is in that UI, he or she will only see items related to prescriptions in order to choose from, in order to give someone access to those, right? Now, in the future, that company buys, I don't know, a payer company. So right now, in the scope of that huge organization, there are not only prescription information, but there is also claims information, EOBs and some other type of information. Now, that repository of items to select from, that was my question. That's the one that needs to be updated all the time based off the whole scope of information that organization has access to, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So exactly. So the patient would only be presented with what's available within that ecosystem's as far as data classes go. So
Ezekiel, you're kind of talking about the interoperability solutions for patient gateways at payers.
Right. What I'm talking is about creating, and of course, I'm new to the concept. I'm still trying to frame my mind regarding it, right? But it's about an enterprise consent management kind of initiative, right? In which we have, okay, this is a repository of all the consents we have ever had by every patient in our organization, right? And this one is not valid anymore, right? But it was valid a year ago. A year ago, Izzy Morales, gave access to this and these doctors, these actors in order for them to see this, right? But of course, the scope of the whole organization and the use case at that moment for which Ezekiel was giving consent is no longer valid, but at least at that moment was valid, right? And the items Izzy was able to choose from were some items at that point, and the actors, I'm saying items and actors, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering right here the lingo, but it's just a placeholder for a name because I'm ignorant if we have any standard naming for those, right? So items, medications, allergies, and actors, providers, doctors, and such, right? And that ecosystem changed over time. And that is the one that we need to keep updating all the time in that organization.
Right. I mean, you're talking about the fact that there's three things that are changing in all, regularly, right? You're saying that there's the data sets about someone and the data set, what's available about someone, changes over time. You're also saying that the metadata about that person, what they're choosing to share, changes over time. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that the framework of the rules that kind of explain how and why you're allowed to share different sets of information, either implicitly or explicitly, also change over time. And that's all knowledge that you'd want to be able to keep and connect over time to ensure that you can answer a question today, about what should be shared and what's permissible, but you can also talk about, why something was shared maybe a year ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I think that's the right way to be thinking about this problem space. Very
good. Thank you very much for the, when you start in this and you did some validation because there is so much information everywhere, right? So good. And probably I'm derailing this, but in lieu that we're only like 5, I will ask another question. So what's the meaning coming from you guys of computable in this scenario? Probably you already answered the question in the previous session, but if you could give me a couple of seconds, of explanation. What is, computable for a consent?
Mohammed, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. What we mean by computable is that a consent that is that contains the rules in a format that is machine readable. So we want to be able to automate the process from whatever user interface or paper form that the patient fills in, from the wishes of the patient to the point of enforcement. We want to streamline that in a way that there wouldn't have to be any intervention manually, and everything could be machine readable. And the crux of this is the consent resource, the FHIR consent resource that actually consolidates these rules. That's where we want the rules to be recorded in a machine readable form, so that a consent decision service and a consent enforcement service can be built based upon those data structures, and using which we can enforce the consent rules.
Very
And
good.
so if I want to go further beyond the abstract thing that I just said, the consent resource, the FHIR consent resource itself allows two ways to have computable rules that are machine readable. Simpler rules can be used, can be encoded using the provision structure there. So provision structure is basically an access control authorization language that enables you to codify rules that are very common in consent scenarios. And then there is also the broader way, the more generic way, when you can use a policy. I think it's the policy attribute. I'm not sure. I have to look this up. That allows an external reference, and then you can use that external reference and use an external language other than FHIR to model your policy, basically the rules of the consent. It could be like an XACML or ODRL or whatever authorization or rights language you could use. But if you want to have a pure FHIR solution, the provision structure is the only way to go. Everything would be in native FHIR format within FHIR resources without any external objects to be processed. And I think that guarantees interoperability, because if you, let's say, use a proprietary language to codify the rules, or a language that is just not FHIR, if you use ODRL, for instance, which is a rights language developed by the W3C, if you use that to codify your rules, the other parties involved with processing of the consent, the partners, they may not understand, they may not have the parsers for ODRL. Whereas if we stick to FHIR across the board, then we can expect everyone to support FHIR. So that's sort of like what I can say as a summary, and we can discuss details, the corners of this.
Mohammed, do you mind if I provide just a agree, but also then a few things that I push back on a little bit? So I think the computable part, I agree 100%. Ezekiel, a big piece of what's important here is that ability to say, without someone intervening, can I come to a decision, right? And if you look at a FHIR consent document or just any FHIR document, it's not necessarily self-contained. So there's all of the normal, aspects of, can I get all the information I need in one place? Can I follow all the references? Do I understand how these consents have been canonicalized, so I know how to interpret certain rules or preferences or properties that are in them? And I think that's a super important task that Mohammed and the team here on LEAP are pushing forward, right? That idea that you have a way of turning all this knowledge into something that's all in the right place at the right time for an engine to compute something and make a decision. I think with respect, what I've seen increasingly is that there's a great deal of interest in how you make the metadata portable. How you make the consents, whether those are informed consents we were talking about earlier, or advanced directives, or just kind of informal decisions about like what app I'm sharing data with. How you make those kinds of things portable, how you make the attributes about me that help inform those decisions portable. I think what I've seen in practice is that almost every organization has a different interpretation of the regulatory landscape, has a different interpretation of what their individual state or their particular slice or vertical or what their market dictates. And so they are defining that, by definition, they're defining their own rules. And so I think that just my personal experience is that when we're talking about computability, the need to be able to be transparent about the rules and policies that you're using, and the need to be able to express to someone if they ask, this is how I'm driving it, this is what I'm using. I think that's super important. The need to get that into FHIR as a portable mechanism because everyone's going to use the same rules over the same data. I think in practice, actually everyone wants to use slightly different rules over the same data. And so I think that rules end up being something that tend to be more in organization, and data becomes something more that needs to be able to transit between those organizations. And that's just what I'm seeing when you go into the enterprise, when you go into particular slices of health and life sciences. That everyone kind of agrees on the rough framework, but the specifics of what one legal team will sign off on versus another is different. So that's just just for what it's worth, Mohammed. I mean, I get your point about wanting to get something standardized. I mean, FHIR doesn't let you express the kinds of rules that you want, which is why you and Dwayne have adopted Exacamal, which I think makes a lot of sense. It's why I've been using Exacamal as one of our expression languages.
No. I want to correct the record. We have not used Exacamal. We've
Okay.
used FHIR natively. We've used FHIR provision structure. That was just the essence of what I was saying.
Okay.
We've provided an Exacamal interface in the API to support anybody who is accustomed to using Exacamal in order to interact with our engine. But internally, we're not relying on Exacamal anywhere as a policy language. We're using FHIR natively, and it's pure FHIR. There's nothing but FHIR in the whole ecosystem. I think the only thing that may not be FHIR is like the PDF that we export, but even those are stored as attachments to the FHIR resources.
Okay, I didn't realize that. That's interesting.
Yeah, the Exacamal, if I need to clarify this maybe in my slides or in the way I describe it. We support purely at the API level, instead of like sending the request in the form of like whatever other JSON structure, you can also use the Exacamal JSON structure to send your query and get a response in the Exacamal format. But the actual policy and the rules are all stored in the FHIR provisions in the consent resource.
Oh, you're just using the JSON profile for the request response for Exacamal.
Yeah. That's just a query interface. I want to go back to, I think it was Ezekiel who asked the question. I want to make sure your question was answered.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my understanding here is we want to have a consent that is self-contained, right, as much as possible, in order for anybody to be able to parse it, and in order for everybody to be able to make a decision at the moment, that is needed. Not having to rely on pointers, other data sets from outside, or other definitions, profiles, and rules from outside. Now, I see that the challenge here is, again, going back to the data sets, right, and value sets. What a data set and a value set that is relevant to one organization might not be to another organization, unless we have a real standardization here, for example, providers by MPI or payers or institutions by, I don't know, TINs or something like that, right? So that is probably a challenge that you guys already thought about it. Maybe it's a challenge, maybe I'm seeing, things that I shouldn't, but that's what I understand. It needs to be understandable, needs to be self-contained, in order to be accessed, understood, and interpreted, and a decision made, based on what is conveyed in the consent.
I kind of want to like get back to like the crux of your question, because I'm not sure I understood it. What difference in value sets is a concern to you that you think we haven't supported or we need to be mindful of?
No. I'm just asking you. This is not an observation about anything that you might not be supporting. It's just validation of concepts, right? It's me learning and understanding what's behind this. Because again, a consent is the coincidence of an item with a patient, with a resource that will be, giving consent to, and an actor, right? All those concepts, right? Now, those actors that are available and that are relevant in one organization might not be in another organization, right?
That's true.
Right.
That's true, but there. So I think now I understand, but I'll let you maybe like expand on that, and then I'll answer.
Right. Right. For example, what it's called a prescriber for a company like SureScripts, for example, is called a provide. The name is a provider, right, for a payer, and it's also a provider for an HR company, right? And the prescriber is coded using, for example, by SureScripts, using the what is named the SPI, SureScripts Provider Identifier, right? So we need to standardize those actors in order for them to mean the same in every context. In the other hand, a company like SureScripts would not have allergies information, for example. They would have medication information. They might have allergies, but just for the sake of an example, right? So the scope of what you can consent to in SureScripts is different to the scope you can consent to in a provider environment, and it's different to what you can consent to in a payer's environment. For example, SureScripts doesn't know about smoking status of a patient, whether the patient smokes or not, you see? So those items that are selectable at the beginning of that interface that you displayed in the are different, right? For every organization. And my question is, how do we standardize that in order for SureScripts to know that what we're talking about in this consent is a smoking status, right?
Right. So these value sets, a lot of them are standardized in FHIR. Like
Good.
the type of information, like there is a content.class in the provision that you could use. It can reference a FHIR resource type. It can reference other types of healthcare information, even non-FHIR types, like a composite CDA and other document formats. So a lot of these value sets basically are standardized in FHIR. And basically you would rely on what's standardized in FHIR in order to, like, they're part of the terminology. There's terminology bindings to these attributes. So that's part of that gap that you're referring to is closed by that. From our perspective, we have tried to stay agnostic to these value sets as much as possible. There are things that, for instance, in the consent decision service, there's like very few things that we basically have a hard dependency on. I have, for instance, I chose to have a hard dependency on the purpose of use value set that is in FHIR, although that was not necessary, but we decided to tie that down to the purposes of use that are mentioned in FHIR in that value set that is part of the FHIR terminology. So those are the only ones that we allow. But for the rest of the stuff, these are basically just codable concepts, and it's a data structure that can be compared with a system code pair. And if you use a different system and code, it will work seamlessly, you know, as long as the consent and the query are in accordance with each other. So basically you use the same value sets that you use to codify your consent when you're asking questions from the consent decision service. So basically the question of terminology is something that is an open ending, and it applies to anywhere else in FHIR. Like if you have an observation of a medication that you, like a prescription resource, the values that you use to standardize the code that you use for expressing what medication is involved in that resource is something that is coming from a terminology service. And yes, you could possibly be in a different jurisdiction or a different environment where those values are different. But there is some level of consensus as far as FHIR itself is concerned with the terminology service and some of the bindings. These are also extensible. Some of them are extensible. You could use other values. But for our structure, as far as I can speak to, purpose of use is one thing that I tied down. And then the other thing that we're looking at was category, the scopes, the consent scope categories that it used to be a separate attribute, and now it's broken down into the consent.category. But even those are not hard tied to a system, a particular vocabulary system. So they're flexible as long as the query and the consent side match.
Sounds good.
Does this make
Thank
sense?
you very much. Yeah, it does. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much.
Thanks. I heard someone else trying to chime in. I'm trying to make sure no one was cut off and everybody gets a chance to speak. Okay, so it seems like either I misheard or whoever wasn't trying to talk changed their mind or they're not on the call anymore. Dwayne, did you have anything else?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Oh, I have one administrative thing. So tomorrow we're starting again at 11. We'll do a touch point. And then for those of you who can and are interested, bring your demonstrations or PowerPoint slides or whatever related to your project. And we'll have an hour to kind of go through those, and I'll dig a little bit deeper on the LEAP implementation. And we'll actually run through all of those tests, the 23 tests for one of our test patients, so we can see those. And then we'll be closing up around 4 p.m. We'll just meet and maybe work on the report out and any other issues. And mostly, what we want to get out of the end of day tomorrow is any recommendations as far as moving forward or things that you'd like to see or shortcomings of FHIR consent that, we're aware of. So that's it for me, Mohammed. So I'll see you all at 11 Eastern time tomorrow morning.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mohammed and Dwayne.
Thank
Okay,
you.
have a
Have a
good day,
great day.
guys. Yeah.